welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media, and today we're joined by Niel, who is with Micro Focus, their Chief Technology Officer. Software supply chains. There's been a lot on supply chains in the last sort of 12 or 18 months. We look at the DevSecOps, people, process and tools. There's a bunch of research that we're going to dive into on this particular session. So without further ado, Niel, the CTO with Micro Focus. Great to have you with us, Niel.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be on My Security TV. Thanks for having me.
No problems. It's our pleasure too. And the CTO, we've been doing a whole bunch of sort of CTO interviews recently as well. Maybe let's dive into your role as a CTO. Sometimes their structure is slightly different and you have a unique job. I wish it's one of those jobs that I would always like. I talk about a real job. So yeah, maybe talk us about the CTO and then we can dive into Micro Focus and the application security work that you've been doing.
Absolutely, Chris. So, a lot of organizations are having a role for a CTO. We have a few of these roles within Micro Focus. So if you're looking at APJ, we have different lines of business. We have channel partners, we have consulting partners. So we do have chief technology officers that work closely with them. And the idea really is to make sure that the right perception of the technology, both inwards and outwards, is maintained, right? So we are addressing the market, we are addressing the need to go to market with our partners and our alliances. So that's the reason why we have these roles. My particular role across APJ is making sure that we align our technology with what we're seeing in the marketplace. And to be honest, the DevSecOps one has been a very interesting journey. So a CTO with DevSecOps, I think the last probably 2 years, 24 months, has been a very interesting journey. And I'm looking forward to sharing more on that with you.
Well, we're talking about the software development life cycle and that supply chain. Now, you're going to refer to some research. I think we're going to dive into sort of why DevSecOps. And this has been going on for some years in terms of the discussion around how it's structured. So let me, if I can, let's and maybe talk us into what we're looking at here.
Sure, Chris. So a couple of years ago, this was actually just as we were entering the pandemic, right? We actually did a study with IDC. We sponsored IDC to do a study across APJ. So it was across 14 countries. It was almost 1,200 enterprise customers, not necessarily all our customers. But what we wanted to do, Chris, was to try and understand how DevSecOps gets adopted. So we had a number of questions. We asked IDC to go and ask a number of different profiles within an enterprise to see what their perception of DevSecOps was. And it was very interesting. And one of the things that they came up with was by 2025, every enterprise is going to have a DevSecOps team in place, mainly because of the digital transformation that we're seeing. It's massive. And the only thing that the pandemic has done, it's accelerated that.
Yep.
And so one of the things that we found was, so this was just as we were entering the pandemic. And when we were coming out of all the working from home and all the heavy restrictions because of the pandemic, what IDC told us was organizations that had a DevSecOps practice in place, irrespective of maturity, but had something in place, they fared better. They were much, much more resilient through the pandemic. So that was a very insightful feedback and observation that we saw. But this was a very interesting study that we did.
Was this about their ability to scale and accelerate because of that? Yeah. Which was sort of the key aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and the thing is, if you want to, within the pandemic or a situation like that, your ability to scale and address your new business needs at speed becomes very critical. So we actually saw that a lot of organizations were struggling. Organizations that did have a DevSecOps practice in place, irrespective of the maturity, fared a lot better. They were far more resilient.
Well, maybe because we're I'm here in Sydney as well. I understand you'll be in Singapore, but let's bring it home for Australia, New Zealand, and what some of the findings were there.
A really good point, Chris. And this was when we saw some of these findings across APJ, and we actually narrowed it down to some of the regions like ANZ and Greater China and India. So this in particular one's a very interesting one for me because for many years I talked about DevSecOps within the realm of compliance. So the compliance was often the driver for me to get my customers on board to look at DevSecOps and take it seriously. But look at this. The drivers were agility and efficiency. So enterprises are understanding the need to be more efficient, And we talk about the shift left, we've heard that considerably. And now we're doing much more testing early on. This is our quality testing. This is our the performance testing. So all of that's happening early on. And now we're doing security as well. How heartening is that? So efficiency is driving that.
Well, I like that one where who decides, and maybe let's walk through those, but the Chief Security Office and the CISO, I imagine, is sort of making that decision. Is that the right one? Because I'm just looking at the third line, they're securing their DevOps processes. Where should security fit? Do you find it does change a little bit? Do you have sort of security first, or is it in the middle, or is it last?
It's very interesting. So I think here, in terms of who decides, the CISO here would have a say in maybe some of the tooling, because it's outcomes driven, right? So from a security perspective, what is it that we want to address? What are the vulnerabilities? What is the risk that we're trying to address? So that's where I think the CISO fits in. IT operations, because we do want to take away the difficulty in the use of tools, right? So the IT operations are quite important here because we want to make it easy for our organizations to go on a DevSecOps journey. Developers, one of the things that we found is developers really want to have tools that integrate really well with the ecosystem. Very, very key if they want to become part of the DevSecOps process. We've seen a bit of pushback, and you see at the top here, budget, automation, a lack of CI/CD tools were some of the obstacles. And this was from the developer side, right? So developers didn't have enough budget to go to market with, buy the right tools, or invest in the right processes, for example. But mainly the automation and the lack of CI/CD tools was a hindrance for that. When we take them away, it becomes really easy for developers to be part of that. And also, it's a culture thing as well, Chris.
Yeah.
Developers, what we felt for a long time, developers weren't necessarily security minded, but that's shifting. What we found as part of the study was security now has become more of a shared responsibility within organizations. Developers want to know about security. They want to understand, how security plays a part in their software development lifecycle and how they build software. And one of the key things we found was they have this desire to learn, but this is where the tooling is important. The tooling has to inform developers why we found vulnerabilities in the software scripting, for example, and why that's a risk. So that's important to have in the platform itself and the tools.
The other one there was cloud development, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, and how that changes the game around sort of software development. You got software sort of defined networking and the like, and the speed and agility and scale. Any comments around or findings around that cloud development? Was it slightly different for Australia and New Zealand versus the rest of the region?
It was very simple. Yeah, it was very much different. We do have a lot of cloud presence here in Australia. Huge transformation, whether it's government, whether it's telcos or the financial sector. Huge transformation that every organization is going through. Cloud is a great platform to start your DevSecOps journey if you haven't done so already. Yep. And one of the aspects of tooling that we found is to give visibility across a hybrid platform. The other thing that's coming up, Chris, is multi-cloud, right? So cloud is becoming a consumer's choice, something that we haven't seen for a very long time, right? So, cloud platforms have been able to kind of dictate how they build out services and so on. But now we are seeing a shift where enterprise has a choice of a cloud platform.
Is it almost too much of a choice? Do you find that they get stuck in particular cloud environments versus a multi-cloud or even a hybrid cloud for some during that migration? But is that a key challenge in terms of selecting that cloud environment?
Well, it's a very interesting point, right? What we've seen is that as we've evolved on the cloud journey, and there's been a mandate, right? So there's regulation that says avoid cloud lock-in. Right? Yeah. So multi-cloud is kind of mandated for a lot of organizations, but also cost is becoming a driver for multi-cloud as well. Now, if you can run certain workloads on a cheaper cloud platform, then you're going to be inclined to do that. But what's interesting is that we're looking at multi-cloud in a very different way now. We're looking at how we can have security across multi-cloud, hybrid as well, and what that security looks like, whether it's mobility of data and security of data, whether it's access across multi-cloud, but also being able to identify what kind of workloads are suitable for different types of cloud platforms. Yep. And then we look at things like cloud native services as well, which is really important. So around there's the whole multi-cloud story is still in its infancy, but I think it's very exciting because it does take the choice to the cloud consumer.
Well, and security has a touch point throughout all of that as well, right? So your security team also has to understand the cloud environment as well as the applications and the software development lifecycle. Now, let's just walk over to the next one here, and we'll build this one out. So securing that software supply chain. And Niel, as I populate this through, talk us through what we're going to be seeing.
Sure, Chris, and this is actually a subset of the whole software supply chain. So if we take the mindset of the the manufacturing world, where raw materials would be delivered to a warehouse or somewhere, and they would enter a manufacturing line, and goods are produced, and they go to delivery, and so on. We start to take the same kind of mindset for software, the software supply chain, right? So this is really a subset of the whole supply chain for software. So if you think about how we build software, where we right from where developers are enrolled onto a network and given access to different services that run within the network, how workstations are provisioned, how we do scanning for vulnerability, how a developer would install software for software development in an organization, right? Then the developer finally gets to do the job that he or she's been asked to do, right, which is develop code. And that code gets written to a repository, and then the code gets promoted for further testing, UAT, system integration. The code goes live. And the thing that we're trying to look at here is the software security assurance, because every organization now is looking at software as is a software developer. Every organization. So we need to have a high level of software security assurance throughout the software development lifecycle. Yeah. And here, all we're seeing is some of the vulnerabilities that we are looking to address: network access vulnerabilities. We need to make sure we validate, verify that the services and resources you have access to are the ones that you should be having access to based on your role and your responsibility. Think about unpatched OS vulnerability across platforms. That is something we need to make sure that we have visibility across, and then making sure that software that's installed on workstations is free of malware. And the one that we see quite often is software compliance. Some enterprises find themselves under licensed for some of the software that might be used for developers, and that's a risk, right? So we're trying to take away risk here in the software supply chain, and then we look at the security testing of application code. But here's an interesting one, Chris. When a developer writes code to a code repository, we can actually have visibility on whether there's abnormal behavior or patterns with reading or writing code from a repository. You think about insider theft, you think about poisoning repositories, those sort of activities that we can get better visibility across, and then making sure that when the code is migrated for further testing, that's done in a controlled manner. And the thing that we want to do is to arrive at a stage where even when the code goes into production, we have good controls on rollback, fallback, and high availability and DR scenarios. But the whole idea here is to look at our software security assurance and make sure that we mature that across this evolution. Because what we found is that, as you saw from the first slide, right, by 2025, every organization will be on this digital transformation journey.
Well, one of the key points is, in terms of the security team, are there different skill sets required, or is it still setting, following a set of principles, or do you find different skill sets are required during this cycle?
There are different skill sets required, and the key thing here is that this can be integrated into whatever an organization already has today, and you can build on that. So, for example, if you already have an identity management solution, you don't necessarily need to go and procure whole new software, right? You can integrate with whatever you have there, right from also looking at things like monitoring across your network. We can do that today with whatever tools you have. The key thing here is to give visibility across the organization on what risk you're being exposed to. Yeah. And build that business resiliency. And this, as we said earlier, this is just a subset of a much broader supply chain.
Well, let's talk about that full cycle, and I'll bring up the key aspect in terms of the people, process, and tools. We sort of touched on there on the skill sets and the people involved. Just the findings here in relation to the research.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the key things, we have our developer community is highly skilled in developing software, highly skilled in integrating with a CI/CD platform, leveraging cloud native services, for example, and tools as well, right? But it's very much a people process tools kind of build, and one of the things that we found is you have to have empathy, Chris. If you're building a DevSecOps practice, you've got to have empathy. Don't delegate security to your developers, but enable them. Have that common sharing. One of the things that we've been kind of embarking on is having brown bag lunches with the security teams and the developers, right? So they can have an understanding of each other's worlds. We do something called a day in the life of a developer, where we understand the kind of pressures a developer is under, rolling out new functionality or new services. A lot of business pressure there, and often, also pressure with, limitation of integration and automation, those areas, and identifying what processes are needed based on the maturity of your organization.
Yeah.
And even the choice of tools is important. So often, when we go and work with customers who are trying to embark on a DevSecOps journey or even evaluate where they are, we often ask them, where are you with your people journey? Where are you as an organization looking at process, and how do you measure outcomes on maturity of process and tool integration? How do you choose those tools? Are they purely based on security outcomes, or are they based on usability by the key guys like your developers? Right, so we do have those conversations to help organizations approach a DevSecOps journey, like I said, with empathy, but be prepared for early shortcomings, right? So don't be disheartened with early failure, but actually plan out for a learning process very, very early on, and also to get business buy-in, right? So to demonstrate early wins to the organization.
Well, I imagine you have to balance the three here, and you might, sort of a bit like a pendulum, need to swing around and give each one the sufficient time when it's needed, and identifying when it's needed as well is probably a key challenge. Processes can often stifle people, and if the tools aren't right, you won't get the processes right. So it's a bit like a Venn diagram, right? They all balance each other out, and they have to be managed individually as well as a group.
Yep, absolutely. And one of the key parts of this, and what we're doing here is kind of creating that mind share here about what a DevSecOps journey looks like. And I think that's quite critical. So some of the things that we do is we do kind of workshops with developers where we talk about OWASP and the OWASP top 10, and help developers understand how those top 10 come about every year, and a bit more understanding of what they mean for organizations. So we do a lot of that, and also best practices as well. So, and a lot of this is education, awareness. And once you have that in place, then the process becomes a bit more easier. Identification of tools becomes easier as well.
I take it they get better over time as well, in trying to keep that team churn down also. So you get a real drive and you get a good team. I take it your observations are, and you mentioned team building and sort of sharing exercises. Have you seen the differences between a team that's not really talking to each other and bad communication versus the ones that really click, and the drive and the agility that they bring as a team?
And Chris, that's been a long time coming. I'll be honest to you. It's taken us a long time to get to building that culture out within organizations. And we are reaching there. For the most part, we are getting there, and we have seen the difference where there is good synergy, where there's a good understanding of roles and responsibilities.
Yeah,
that's helped a lot. So making sure that we help the developers understand that we're not delegating security to you, but we're trying to enable you to become a bit more security minded. Right. Yeah. Ultimately, the security teams are there to help us understand policy, define policy, right? And that's their responsibility, and that's their charter. And now what we need to do is to understand how that filters down to yourself as a developer, and also application owners, for them to understand the risk that they bring to the organization if they release functionality far too sooner without the right testing in place. So, a lot of this has been about creating mind share, but it's coming together. We're seeing a lot of progress there, but we do have to have that empathy there. That's
really, we do hear a lot that the discussions around cyber is on leadership, team building, culture. And so I think this is really where the rubber hits the road when you're having those discussions, is when you're working with teams. it is all about sort of that leadership and development. And I suppose this brings us to this session here in terms of the maturity stages, because I've worked in bad teams and I've worked in highly performing teams, and where you click and you do notice the performance difference. So yeah, just talk us through that and maybe the observations on what are probably the most common ones here and some of the common mistakes made that sort of prevent that maturity.
Sure, Chris. And this is actually a slide that I take a lot away from, because I think it's important for organizations to understand that if you're embarking on a DevSecOps journey, these are the things that you want to measure to, but you're not going to be a disruptor on day one or even 3 months' time, right? You're going to be somewhere between ad hoc and optimistic. And we want to help you understand the people aspect, where do you find there's a skills gap? Where do you find the process gap? And then we start to look at the kind of tools that we need to make it a bit more efficient. And also for the organizations to understand the wins that they're making through this process. Ad hoc, a lot of organizations sit between ad hoc and optimistic. And we move towards repeatable, and that's good. And this is where we start to see some of the play for automation come in. So between repeatable and managed, we see a lot of play for automation. And disruptor is where we see really the opportunity for us to become a lot more innovative, and we can really answer the what if, the art of the possible. We can really address that at the disruptor stage. And we're seeing a lot of organizations gain to that stage. It might take a while, but you have to really look at, building out the blocks and understanding what the outcomes are and how you measure them. And again, roles and responsibility is very, very key. And like you mentioned earlier, having the right type of leadership.
I take it you don't necessarily need to be at that disruptor level all the time as well. You might sort of that agile approach where you might sort of do sprints in certain directions, but at least you've got the ability to be a disruptor. But repeatable and managed are probably the key ones. It looks like at this point, I'm reading this, is 38% and nearly 30% of respondents. So that seems to be sort of the meaty area where teams are in terms of their maturity, and then able to scale up or speed up to become disruptors. Is it something worth practicing as a team, and maybe ideas on how you would potentially do that?
I think, you raised a really good point. You should never become complacent, even if you become a disruptor, right? You should always be looking at how you can do things differently and use technology, right? Use technology in a very innovative way. And also that comes back down to process and people again, right? How ready is your workforce to become a disruptor again? So you're always constantly looking at where is the gap? We're seeing new technology being available every single day. And we want to make sure that we're able to leverage that new technology for new business outcomes, new innovation. And the only way we can do that is if we keep ahead of being a disruptor.
Yeah. The opportunistic, how reasonable is it to put a team together to take on opportunities in this space? We're hearing a lot on skill shortages, but you've also got the tool sets there that might sort of circumvent a lack of skills. The ad hoc and opportunistic, are they necessarily bad sort of maturity levels? If the opportunistic one there, a sort of a startup or a scale up, taking those opportunities, is that a degree of maturity, or is it measured on the integration within the business?
Chris, that's a really good point you make. And the thing is, not every organization is going to start up as being a repeatable or optimistic, or even more likely be ad hoc.
Yep.
And the thing is, you do have to give organizations that time to settle in and stabilize, right? So that you get to you stabilize across some of the process and the people. And then you start to look at, okay, well, how do I go to the next level? And we're seeing a lot of that, and not just, one of the things that I found in my time in Asia is regulation. I found some parts of APJ heavily regulated and some parts of APJ not so heavily regulated. And a lot of it was to do with the maturity of those countries. And it's very similar here. An organization might not have the bandwidth, like you mentioned, startups.
Yeah.
Startups are often very small teams. And what you're asking them to do is to invest more and do more, and they just don't have the bandwidth.
Yeah.
But they will get to a stage where it becomes really important for them to be resilient. So it will naturally come to them.
I think we use the term bandwidth a lot in our business as well. And it's one of those things, you can't be at the end of your bandwidth all the time. Otherwise, you're going to be burnt out. And I think it's understanding what that plan is. When we look at here, the software supply chains, how forward planning do you need to be? Is planning everything in terms of how you have your software defined? You talked about that supply, the life cycle and the development cycle. How forward do you need to be planning, and is planning sort of the key aspect here?
Planning becomes more appreciable once you've gone through one cycle, right?
Yeah, right.
What we found is that at the start of the journey, our teams don't really know what they're planning for.
Yes.
And, from some of the shortcomings and failures we have, we understand we should be planning for things better. So once we've gone through one whole life cycle, we think, okay, I've got a good idea of what I want to plan for. And we start planning for those things. But in each cycle, we keep becoming more and more efficient. We start to do more things earlier on, and that's quite key. So, early on, do prepare for some shortcomings. Do, prepare for some being blindsided by some things, I mean, let's face it, who would have planned for the pandemic?
Yeah.
I mean, that hit us so hard. And then, we had to be, very receptive to that and really, it really tested our resilience. So I think that it's important to be open-minded on how that journey looks like. But every cycle that you go through, you plan to be more efficient, more innovative, and actually leveraging technology far more efficiently. Automation is key. Once you've gone through one cycle, you think, well, we could have automated some of those things.
Yeah.
On the security side, we could give visibility to security teams much, much more earlier on. Preparing for bringing on temporary workers, outsourcing software development, for example. All of these components kind of become a bit more easy for us to understand once we've been through that cycle.
Was that learning sort of process, learning organization approach, but that also brings us to cyber res and resilience within that team, and as well as in the software itself. Maybe introduce us to this, because our takeaway today will be a 2022 AppSec trend report. It's a white paper from, it's cyber res, but it's part of Micro Focus. It introduces to cyber res and the thinking around that approach.
Absolutely, Chris. So about two and a half years ago, Micro Focus decided that we weren't investing enough into our security portfolio, and we could leverage a lot more from that portfolio, mainly because of what we were hearing from customers. So what we did was Micro Focus decided to have a line of business, cyber res, where we invested a lot more into our R&D, into our marketing, into our go-to-market strategy altogether. And that was about 70 million investment. And that was about 2.5 years ago.
Right.
Early on, Chris, we didn't have a name for our line of business. And this was at the start of the pandemic. And one of the things that we kept hearing about was cyber resiliency.
Yeah.
So the term cyber res naturally came to us, but it's something that resonates really well with customers. And one of the key things that around the AppSec trend, Chris, is one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is a huge growth on DevSecOps. And, we're even seeing some of the power shifting from the infrastructure guys to the developer community. We're seeing a shift in quite a lot of power and control there. And we're also seeing a need for them to become a little bit more security aware. So it's an interesting shift, and that's why we're seeing a lot of thought leadership on cloud adoption, on DevSecOps, on our sharings around OS. And one of the things that we do, Chris, is to help organizations with that maturity. Helping them understand where they are today, how the teams are aligned to business outcomes, and start to build on what that journey looks like.
Yeah. Well, look, it is an interesting process because you mentioned infrastructure and development teams. I imagine some of them need to be coming together as well, because you've got cloud native applications and I mentioned software defined networking and those kind of things as well that can change the dynamic of how an application can work. Look, do recommend this white paper. We'll have a link in the show notes on this, but it does talk you through the key trends in the software supply chain, as we've been talking to Niel about today. So Niel, thank you so much. I trust you're safe there in Singapore. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. As I said, we will have the white paper available in the show notes and a bit more about Niel and his work as CTO with Micro Focus. So Niel Pandya, thank you very much for joining us today on My Security TV.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.